Hello and welcome to the Classic Spa Circuit in Belgium from Ben Edwards and John Watson. Classic Circuit and classic weather here in the Ardennes. The rain has been falling since first thing this morning, and conditions for this first qualifying are going to be very difficult to say the least. Indeed, the Benetton team are already down to one car for this session, with Johnny Herbert becoming the first victim of the weather in this morning's free practice session.
Well, conditions here at Spa on Friday morning were, I would say, typical of the area. The Ardennes, of course, famous for that blotting paper effect. As soon as any cloud is around, it turns into rain, and the circuit pretty atrocious by anybody's standards, and in fact Johnny Herbert was the one that was caught out worst. He came out of La Source Herpen, appeared to accelerate normally, and literally out of camera sight. The car then turned sharp right, hit the concrete retaining barrier, which in fact protects the original pits at the Spa circuit, and then bounced across the track. Went quite a long way, in fact, and by the time the car came to a standstill and the rescue services got to Johnny Herbert, he was shaken and in fact taken off to the medical centre for a checkup. And apparently privately he said, well, I remember driving the car and I remember in the medical centre, but the bit in between I'm not entirely clear about. So Johnny Herbert will be given a quick once-over by Professor Watkins, the Formula One doctor, to ensure that if he is given the opportunity to practice, to qualify this afternoon, it will have to be in Michael Schumacher's race car, and that's something I'm not quite certain that the Benetton team would be prepared to do. But principally, it will come down to whether Johnny Herbert is past fit to drive this afternoon. There you see on screen, those are the conditions. They are appalling. That is the main straight here after the revisions to Le Rouge and to the Radillon. And anybody who goes out here this afternoon, the first car out will be out on a major adventure.
Indeed they will. We're just looking into the Jordan pit garage at the moment. Rubens Barrichello looking fairly relaxed. Remember, of course, he took pole position here last year in similar conditions. It was the Friday qualifying session. It started off very wet, just dried up a little bit towards the end, and Rubens timed his run to perfection, just getting onto slick tyres, going out with the checkered flag in sight virtually, and grabbing that pole position. Let's just tell you what happened this morning in terms of times. It was Jean Alesi, not very surprisingly, I suppose, in the wet conditions, setting the fastest time at 2 minutes 15.990, and just 12 thousandths of a second behind him, Heinz Harald Frentzen. David Coulthard was third, Mika Hakkinen fourth, Olivier Panis fifth, and Rubens Barrichello sixth. But the times not meaning a great deal as the track conditions changing it a little bit towards the end. And for the two main championship rivals, not quite such good runs.
Well, Damon Hill uncharacteristically stuck it in to the gravel traps, and that ended his session 10 minutes before the already shortened part 2 of the morning practice session draw to a close at 11:30. Michael Schumacher in and out of the pits, not totally comfortable with the car, but in fact it was a question of when were you out on the track, and at the very end of the session there was the hint of a line appearing, but since that 1.5 hours the track has become wetter again, and rain right now falling steadily, and a familiar scene in the pit lane because people really deciding when to go out, and they don't want to be the first person out. They don't want to be the one that really has to make that commitment. So I would suspect that the second part of this qualifying session is going to see, as ever, a flurry of activity. But of course, knowing how difficult and how treacherous this Spa-Francorchamps circuit is in wet weather conditions, it is going to be a very trying and testing session for all 24 competitors.
Now, John, you've caused a little bit of sort of furore in the paddock already this weekend. You made some comments before the weekend started on CFAX about your views of this circuit, which are a little at variance with the views of many of the drivers.
Well, I'm disappointed it's only caused a little furore. I wanted to cause a big furore. Basically, what I said in a preview I do for every Grand Prix was that racing drivers seem to have a selective attitude towards what corners they like, which corners they don't like, which are safe, which are not. And with the reintroduction of Eau Rouge in its original form with improved safety, I was saying that why do drivers praise and eulogize this particular corner, yet in other circuits we have seen those corners either changed in total character or certainly some significant character, and you have to cite circuits like Imola, the Tamburello, that fateful corner we saw last year, but also look at Monza, the two Lesmo corners, and the Curva Grande. Drivers are saying those corners are unsafe. We refuse to drive on those circuits unless they change them. Canada, that very fast right, left, right on the return run back to the start, finish straight. Even in Barcelona, they changed the layout of the circuit there. Yet everybody comes to Spa and says, isn't it wonderful to go down into Eau Rouge at 290 kilometers per hour and go flat out through it? Great stuff. Well, what's wrong with all the other corners and all the other circuits? Why have they had to be so dramatically changed, yet still come to Spa and say, oh, we think it's wonderful? My point was, would drivers please start being more consistent? And once they do that, then they will be taken more seriously. But as long as their points of view seem to be, as I say, selective, that's what they're going to be viewed as.
Well, the Eau Rouge corner back to its former shape and taken away that chicane that we saw here last year. They have increased the gravel trap, the runoff areas a little bit around the corner, but one or two of the drivers commenting yesterday that it wasn't quite as big an area of runoff as they might have expected.
I think the trouble is drivers get shown plans of circuit layout and changes, and what was the previous layout, here's the new layout, 100% improvement, let's say, but 100% of safety increase may only be a very small in reality. I think Martin Brundle summed it up very well when he said that prior to the changes we've seen for this year, you had a second gear corner runoff area for a corner that was almost 300 kilometers per hour. I'm going up by factors of 10 in this speed, but certainly say 290 kilometers per hour, the entry speed to Eau Rouge. Now you've got double the runoff area, but it's only the amount of runoff area that would be accepted for a fourth gear corner, and this is sixth gear flat out.
Well, that controversy is set to continue a little bit over the weekend, and certainly the drivers not taking part in any driving at the moment. We are about 7 minutes into this first qualifying session, and still absolutely no activity on the circuit whatsoever. You had a quick wander through the pit garages a moment ago, but it's only going to be a little while before there's action on track. To Spa for first qualifying, but we still haven't had any cars out onto the circuit yet in this first official session. And the weather conditions fairly consistent so far this morning. It's been drizzly rain most of the morning, but it's been getting heavier sometimes and lightening up a little bit. But, well, we're just waiting really, and I think the teams are as well, to try and find a little bit of a window in the weather to come out and set some quick times and get this session underway.
But of course, the same problem that we've seen in many Grand Prix this year. It's been a pretty wet year on average. Nobody wants to be the first person out. That person's going to have to be the one that breaks, if you like, the film of water all around any racetrack. Once people go out, once they get an indication that the circuit is going to produce a certain time, and they look above and see what the weather is liable to do, then you'll get a flurry of activity on the track. But here at Spa-Francorchamps, the problem is that what it might be doing in the pits doesn't bear any relationship at all to what may be happening at the highest part of the circuit. That's at the end of the straight up at Lake Coombe, or further down at the bottom of the circuit under Stavelot. So, as is traditional in Spa, and even going further back into the history of this circuit, when we used to run on an 8.5-mile circuit, you could have bone dry conditions in the pits all the way back to 1966. That Grand Prix started dry, halfway round, it was a downpour, one of the worst Grand Prix here in the history of Spa. But it is so typical of this area of the Ardennes. Weather patterns can change dramatically, and what we saw here this morning after a beautiful day on Thursday was, well, traditional Spa weather. But it equally can change as dramatically as it did this morning. So the prospects for drying up, let's say, and producing a hint of a dry line as we had here last year, when I made that wonderful prediction, I said, forget it, Allard, no way is it going to dry up. Well, Rubens Barrichello proved us wrong, because he went out at the very end on slicks and got his only pole position in his career, and that in fact is the only pole position for the Jordan team. At that time, of course, powered by Brian Hart. Well, everybody looking around anxiously, and David Coulthard, strong performance from the young Scot, and in fact it's an interesting situation with David Coulthard, who we know now will not be driving for Rothman's Williams Renault team in 1996. And since, in fact, Jacques Villeneuve made that test at Silverstone, and that test led to his inclusion into the team for 96, David Coulthard has been very, very strong in testing. Now, he has got to convince people, above all that he's done so far this year and from last year, he is the man to fill the second McLaren seat, the second Ferrari seat, maybe, but probably less likely, the second Benetton seat. His manager has stated with confidence, nothing to worry about. David Coulthard will be in a top 4 team seat. If you look at the teams who are currently the top 4, you've got Benetton, Williams, Ferrari, and Jordan. Now I wonder, is David Coulthard's manager referring to Jordan as a possibility for David Coulthard, as opposed to maybe McLaren, which is the team that most people believe that David Coulthard really is looking towards? So a lot more interest in the driver market. Gerhard Berger still to confirm whether he will remain at Ferrari or may accept an opportunity to go to McLaren as well. And as we said, that the first car, Olivier Panis, finally, and thank goodness, decides that we are in the entertainment business as well as the sport of Formula One, right onto the track.
So the Ligier Mugen, the first car onto the circuit, they've got a new engine here to use this weekend, although they're not using it in this first qualifying session. They're planning to use it in the race itself, and one of the cars will have it in tomorrow's qualifying. They tested it at Silverstone last week and fairly happy with the way things are going. But Olivier Panis at the moment putting up with the previous specification of Mugen Honda engine. But nonetheless, a good engine, a very strong V10 engine in the back of the Ligier. And of course, Panis had a good result last time out, another point with that 6th place in Hungary. And he's now got 8 points in the championship, lying in 7th place. And that's keeping Ligier just ahead of McLaren in the Constructors' battle.
I'm talking about that new Mugen V10 engine that will be in the back of one of these 2 cars on Saturday, but in both cars for Sunday. The engine revs higher, it's got more horsepower, and what they've also got, but they're not able to use as yet, is a fly-by-wire throttle. But because of the regulations relating to computers and the access that the FIA now must have to all the computing on board a Formula One car, that has got to get the stamp of approval from the FIA, and that takes time. So that fly-by-wire throttle mechanism, which will further enhance the driving characteristic and qualities of the engine, will not be available until Monza, possibly even as late as the Portuguese Grand Prix. But again, just further development, non-stop development. That's the nature of the game of Formula One, and is it ever costly?
Pedro Lamy is the only other car onto the circuit at the moment. Remember, the young Portuguese driver driving the Minardi Ford in place of Pierluigi Martini, took over the car in Hungary, finished the race, put in a good performance as well, and certainly coming back from those horrendous injuries he suffered testing for Lotus last year with a good solid performance in a difficult Grand Prix. David Coulthard getting ready to come out. Damon Hill also ready, as we saw just a few moments ago. So it looks as though we're about to see some action beginning here at Spa. And what a critical weekend it is in many ways, with the driver market still very much up in the air. And interesting to see how well Heinz Harald Frentzen went this morning. Remember, he's one of those being discussed in terms of the second Benetton seat. But Rubens Barrichello was also going very quickly. And I think a good result here this weekend, both in qualifying and the race, could be critically important as the teams discuss their futures.
Well, as the principal players have got their seats for next year nicely signed, sealed, and probably the first stage payments already winging away to those bank accounts, it now remains for David Coulthard. Frentzen is under contract. He has got a deal with Sauber. There is a buyout clause, but as in the case of many drivers in Formula One, these buyout clauses don't come cheaply. So Frentzen has been mentioned in connection with a number of teams. Barrichello likewise is looking to move to fresh territory. In the case of Barrichello, I think that maybe his timing is about right. He's been with Jordan for 3 seasons, and you know, for the development of a driver, it is good to, at some point, before you become too established and too settled, to explore other possibilities, to find out where you stand in relation to your competitors and also in relation to other teams. David Coulthard, of course, is the name that really appears to be the biggest loser in the driver market right now, but we have to wait and see what position David Coulthard will have. His management certainly seem confident enough that it will be something competitive.
So Olivier Panis showing us around the Spa circuit. Remember, 4.3 miles long this track. It's the longest circuit on the World Championship Trail. And Michael Schumacher there just wandering back towards the pit garage. And it looks as though he's getting ready to come out onto the circuit himself. So I think we'll start to see some more activity. It's still only Olivier Panis and Pedro Lamy on the circuit. And there, the driver who was fastest this morning put in a fabulous display as ever, Jean Alesi.
And if ever a display of contempt for a racetrack was that of Jean Alesi, it was just unreal. And I mean, coming down through Eau Rouge, this controversial corner, the one that every driver, of course, says he does love, but in wet weather conditions and still approaching the corner, maybe some 10 kilometers less than you would do in the dry. But it is a mighty, mighty impressive corner, and the commitment that a driver has to make for it is unparalleled in any other race, any other circuit that I think currently in Formula One use. And there we see just how slippery it is. And in fact, the slipperiness allowed Panis to maintain the momentum of that spin, continued onwards. So there, Jean Alesi, he will have seen that and made a little mental register. Once again, just watching what happens, turns and everything seems fine, a little bit wide, misses the apex. The back end comes around, he picks up the throttle and the back end just drifts away. Olivier Panis entertains us briefly.
Pedro Lamy in the Minardi Ford. He's only the second driver to have been on the circuit. Olivier Panis is currently fastest in this first qualifying session. Pedro Lamy second, and nobody else has bothered to come out yet. The weather conditions just too wet, too slippery, but it's not really raining at the moment, so the prospects of the session improving are pretty good, and perhaps we'll see the whole thing build up into a tremendous climax, just as we did last year. Just crossing the line there goes Olivier Panis, no improvement on the last lap, and Lamy just coming back onto the road section, heading back towards start-finish.
Well, this is a long climb uphill out of Stavelot, through these rights, then the double left at Blanchimont. In the dry, just about flat out. I mean, a driver will always say, sure, flat all the way. Talk to the engineers, look at the telemetry traces. You'll see the feathering of the throttles. There's only one or two drivers out there who will be flat out. And it's an awesome sight, just as it is watching them down through Eau Rouge. In these conditions, it is very slippery indeed. Remember, this is public road we're on, though, in fact, this circuit is due to become a total permanent circuit. And just to add a little bit of interest, Pedro Lamy has in fact eclipsed Olivier Panis. He's gone quickest by 54 hundredths of a second. And just looking at momentarily at the Jean Alesi's face, it's as if he's never blinked in the 5 minutes since we last had a look at him in camera on the screen.
Massimiliano Papis is the next one to come out onto the circuit. And, well, he had a bit of an off this morning in the free practice session in the second part. Remember, the free practice is split into two parts, and just after the beginning of the second part, he took it off the road, but with the stoppage to that session with Johnny Herbert going off, they were able to get the car back, and he went out for a few more laps towards the end of the session. But relatively inexperienced, of course, Papis. He'll be starting his third Grand Prix here this weekend. And he's raced here before at Spa in Formula 3000. But quite a different situation in Grand Prix car. And you can just see, by the way, looking at his helmet, he's wearing one of the yellow visors. Quite a few of the drivers using those yellow visors for better contrast in these rather grey conditions.
It enhances the driver's vision. It, in effect, lightens everything up. And in these conditions, driving on your own, it's no problem. But what happens, and what we did see this morning, was that the cloud came down, and in fact, parts of the circuit vision was very, very limited. On top of that, the spray that is thrown up, particularly on the faster parts of the circuit. And there you see now, as Massimiliano Papis makes his way down in a long left-hand boohoo corner. A corner again in the dry that really is very satisfying. It's an early apex that the car run wide, and then at the end of the corner you come back in and make the second apex. But in the spray of other cars, literally you're blind, and that slightly tinted yellow visor just makes things slightly easier to define. Now, coming into the first part of Stavelot, you could just see locking up of brakes. That's something is a problem in the wet with the carbon fiber brakes. Getting brake temperatures right is a major decision a team has got to take. Sounds very fundamental. There are different brake manufacturers involved in Formula One, and they have got different characteristics. You've got to put lots of tape on the air scoops on these brakes to get them up to temperature. Also, if you get water getting onto the brake disc, you can, in fact, sometimes get a film of water, which, again, when you put the brake on, means there ain't much brake. So to see locking brakes on carbon fibre brakes isn't any big surprise.
So Olivier Panis has retaken the fastest time from Pedro Lamy, and Panis crosses the line. He's yet to do a timed flying lap, though. You can see the car a little unstable under braking into the last off hairpin. This classic shot of this first gear hairpin and then plunging downhill. You can see the back end of the car just stepping out, and that was when he was changing up into third gear, and that's exactly the point that Johnny Herbert went off this morning, hitting the concrete wall on the right-hand side of that piece of track. So Damon Hill now coming out of his pit garage. It's very tight here in the pit lane, and usually they have to reverse a little almost three-point turn to get out of their pit garage. And then Hill will be the first of the front runners, although Eddie Irvine just slightly ahead of him at the end of the pit lane.
Well, some 13 minutes and 23 seconds of this session, so we wait to see what happens when Irvine and Damon Hill take to the circuit. But actually, Panis was very, very impressive this morning. He ended up 5th quickest again. It was simply a matter of when you actually completed your last lap, as the circuit by the second was getting quicker and quicker. Damon Hill on the track for the first time since he had that off 10 minutes before the end of the morning session. Eddie Irvine, he ended up 7th quickest, just directly behind teammate Rubens Barrichello. So that bright orange helmet of Irvine's in these very dull conditions, very distinctive indeed. And this is the highest point of the circuit, just after Les Combes, and at the point where then the cars begin to drop down through Malmedy and into Rivage. But this is a man really who was, I think, the most exciting to watch. And at one stage we cut to the face of Jean Alesi in the pit lane, and it was almost, you could see almost agony in his face. He didn't want to watch the screen. He knew that his man Alesi was out there putting on a virtuoso performance, the kind of performance that drivers in these conditions cannot resist. That's the irony, the anomaly of being a race driver. When rationale and common sense should play its part, what does a driver do? He goes out to show the world how good he really is. Teammate Gerhard Berger makes his way out onto the track, and Gerhard Berger, as ever, in trouble, down in 8th place. But knowing that the Ferrari is capable of being very competitive, and particularly in wet weather conditions, we've seen throughout the year just how good this car is. David Coulthard following teammate Damon Hill, and suddenly that flurry that we'd hoped to see is about to happen.
So things certainly beginning to hot up a little bit, and Eddie Irvine coming round. He'll be starting his first time lap, remember, just through the bus stop chicane with all the writing on the road from the Belgian fans about Mansell and Villeneuve, and certainly quite a few fans here already today, even though it's a Friday and it's wet and pretty miserable. There's certainly a lot of support here in Belgium. A lot of Brits coming over to this race as well. It's not too far away, a good one to visit, and a great place to spectate at various parts around the circuit. Really see a Formula One car in action at high speed around some of the most demanding corners in the world. So Jean Alesi then, there is Jean Todt, looking a little more relaxed than he was earlier when Jean Alesi was setting those very quick times. And Alesi, well, let's hope the camera stays with him. He should provide plenty of entertainment.
At the minute, the circuit is about a second and a half slower than it was at the end of the sessions this morning. And Olivier Panis' time is currently 2 minutes 18.930. Still the quickest, but it will not be very long, we think, before Jean Alesi, irrepressible, dynamic, exciting, and of course now a Benetton man for 96 and thereafter. There's Luca Badour in, well, is he trying to get out of the pits, or has he stalled the car at the exit to the pits? Alesi crosses the line. That was his first lap out, 1 minute, or 27 minutes, 7.074 seconds. So watch Alesi plunge downhill. Oh, Alesi in all sorts of trouble. Almost a repeat of what happened to Johnny Herbert. That was Alesi's fault. He let the left rear drop over, and Alesi has to be very careful. The contempt he showed the circuit this morning, he got away with. He will not get away with it again. Let's watch Alesi lets the car run out to the very edge. At the very end where the Armco barrier finishes, there's a little drop off. The car just caught. Look, fishtails left, right. The marshal wide, he ducks for cover. That's for Johnny Herbert, smacked it. Now, Alesi was doing over 100 miles an hour at the point when the marshal ducked for cover. You cannot afford to be that cavalier.
Well, Alesi looks as though he's still on a fast lap. Let's just take another look. You can just see he clipped that white line, and look how close he got to that concrete wall. That's exactly the point that Johnny hit. He hit it hard with the front of the car, wiped the nose cone off the car, Johnny Herbert, and then ended up spinning several times down the road before he came to a stop. And Jean Alesi missed the same fate by just fractions of an inch. So he's continuing on this lap, and again he's sliding it as he comes back down the hill through Pouhon. And now plunging. He's got traffic ahead of him. Looks like one of the Tyrrells just up ahead. But Alesi closing up towards Mika Salo, and it looks as though this could be a fast lap. But let's to tell you that Damon Hill has set the fastest time so far at 2 minutes 16.9, and that's just under 2 seconds faster than Eddie Irvine, who's second.
And interestingly, that time from Damon Hill is about a second now off the quickest time that we saw this morning from the man on camera. Jean Alesi looking to squeeze. He comes up to the first part of the Blanchiment. He has to go offline onto the wet, now into the second and more demanding bit. Now stay off those curbs, Alesi, because once you're on that, you will be trapped, and even worse, in big trouble. Under braking coming into the bus stop chicane. Car squirming all over the racetrack. Careful on the exit not to be too aggressive with the throttle. Those barriers will open their arms and suck you in.
Not fast enough to beat Damon Hill's time, 2:18.4, as you can see. Alesi goes second, Irvine still third. Then it's Panis. Martin Brundle is fifth, and Pedro Lamy is in sixth place. But we're beginning to see a lot more action, and Gerhard Berger on the circuit as well now. Gerhard has only just come out of the pit, so he's got to complete this lap before he goes on to a timed lap. But nonetheless, he was in a determined mood as well this morning. Gerhard Berger currently down in sixth place in the World Championship on 25 points. He's had a lot of bad luck this year, and he's had a lot of bad luck with Ferrari here at Spa. In fact, he's never seen the checkered flag in a Ferrari here at Spa. An amazing result, but looking for better things, obviously, this year.
Well, I suppose that's a pretty positive frame of mind to approach a Grand Prix. But Gerhard Berger, who's, I think, character, nature, he's always smiling. Even when he's in a bad mood, there's always a sense of mischievousness about him. Of course, been in Grand Prix racing since 1984, and there's not an awful lot left to learn for Gerhard Berger, but there's still a lot of ambition in this 36-year-old Austrian driver. He still believes there is a World Championship in him. Whether he stays at Ferrari for 96, whether he moves elsewhere, we still are unsure. But Gerhard Berger, second quickest currently, on his way, third lap.
Interesting to note that it's his birthday as well on Sunday, Gerhard Berger, and if they go according to the plan, Jean Alesi winning on his birthday in Montreal. So could this be a good weekend for Berger? We shall wait and see. But as he is the second fastest to Damon Hill, Jean Alesi third, then Irvine Frentzen has come up into fifth place now, just ahead of Olivier Panis.
And good news for all the Johnny Herbert fans who just had news from the Benetton team that Johnny is cleared to drive. The bad news is he hasn't got a car because his chassis, that tub, was in fact written off. The master cylinders in the front of the car were pushed through the front bulkhead. That chassis now will be relegated to the biffer bin. There is a new tub being built up as we speak, but that car will not be available until Saturday morning for practice, and the prospects of Johnny being given the opportunity in these demanding conditions to go out and try and qualify is very unlikely. In the meantime, Jean Alesi has eclipsed Damon Hill. He is now provisionally quickest by 0.485 of a second, and we're still watching Gerhard Berger, currently the second part of the Ferrari sandwich, in third place.
So Ferrari's looking pretty good in the wet conditions here at Spa at the moment, and certainly Alesi been so impressive in the wet everywhere we've been so far this year. In fact, the last event in Hungary, the last Grand Prix weekend in Hungary, was the first time this year that we didn't have a wet track at some point over the course of the weekend. Well, I think the weather gods are trying to make up for that at Spa so far. Here, there is Alesi again, just on the curb slightly at the top of the hill, then plunging down into the tight right hand. You can see he goes in pretty wide there, looking for a little bit more grip perhaps.
In these conditions on many circuits, it is better to take the wider line. And that was down through Rivage. Now he's going to plunge downhill. And this coming down, you see there is a drying line. So times will begin to improve. David Coulthard gone quickest, 2 minutes 15.745, and we haven't even seen the young Scots. Gerhard Berger back to Jean Alesi, and look at the way Alesi just throws the Ferrari down in the Spaniard's corner, then coming down into Stablo. This is where we've seen a lot of locking of brakes. It is done. There it is. Jean Alesi inside front, momentary locking up. Damon Hill just gone third quickest. So Coulthard fastest, Alesi second, Hill third, Berger fourth, Mika Häkkinen, he's just gone out, and Mika Häkkinen at one point this morning was also quickest. So Häkkinen fifth, Irvine sixth, Frentzen seventh, Hannes eighth, Martin Brundle ninth, Luca Badour, the first of the two Minardi Fords with the customer Ford engine. Everybody else ahead of Luca Badour, of course, has got a fully blessed factory engine.
So are we going to see an improvement from Alesi on this lap? Uses the curbs on the exit of the bus stop. 2:15.7 is the time to beat. It's a 15.812. So Jean Alesi second fastest, but this session is really going to build and build. There's no rain falling now, and as we saw at some parts of the circuit, there's already a dry-ish line beginning to develop, and it's going to be another classic qualifying session, very much like the one on Friday last year, with the track drying up a little bit, and of course everybody having to go for it because the weather forecast is not that great for this weekend, and the second qualifying could be fully wet.
Well, you've got to take your chances when they exist, but of course watching skyward to see what the weather is doing. Right now there is no rain. There on the straight you can see how quickly a dry line is developing, coming down out of Puho, coming down to the lowest point of the circuit again with Damon Hill. There's a drying line. Still puddles in parts of the circuit, but as long as you can see the track is beginning to dry, then it's going to be faster. And teams sitting in the pits, they have these monitors. They know precisely what's going on. The danger for anybody is that they go too soon. On the other hand, you might think, well, if I sit back and wait till the last 10 minutes of this session, I'm going to be in good shape, lots of laps left. It might rain again. In Spa, this is the biggest lottery in town, and it's almost just like stick the tail on the donkey, go with what you know, and if you don't get what you expect, well, just hope and pray that on Saturday things will be better.
Damon Hill about to complete his lap. Let's see if he can now beat David Coulthard. Time of 15.745. Well, look at that. It's a 15.143. And Damon Hill takes the fastest time. He's completed 5 laps now. Remember, the limit as ever here at Spa is 12 laps that they're allowed to do in each qualifying session. And so they will be wanting to save up some of those laps for the end of the session in case it is that much drier. As John said, that can sometimes lead to other disasters. And like this morning, for example, we had a red flag when a car went off the track. Quite often that happens, and it then rains again during the red flag period, and everybody who left it to the last minute loses out.
Well, look at Damon Hill. Very, very positive as he came through Eau Rouge. Car looks great. Damon currently quickest, and track conditions literally by the lap getting better. I would imagine unless traffic or some unforeseen problem arises, this will be a further improvement. Now, we were talking about taking the wider line. Damon Hill comes back in the second part of that Rivage corner. The reason why drivers opt for a wider line in some corners is because dependent on the track surface, and in particular if there's been resurfacing, you get a lot of surface oil comes up, and mixture of oil and water guaranteed to make it slippery. So sometimes the quicker line in a corner is the longer way around. You feel the grip. And normally in the dry, you'd never dream of doing it. Look at the way that car, he just throws it in. That's confidence in your machine, and that's a machine that gives you confidence. The two things totally invaluable for a driver.
Michael Schumacher still sitting in the pits. He's not yet been onto the circuit. He's quite happy to let everybody help dry the circuit off for him, and then he wants to come out and try and blitz the times that have been set so far. He was pretty quick this morning. At one time he headed the list, dropped down towards the end of the session, not going out towards the end. But I think we'll see Schumacher as competitive as ever here. Damon Hill now coming through the last couple of corners into one of the slowest corners, apart from the last hairpin, but in fact, he's coming into the pits. So Hill fastest, Coulthard second, Jean Alesi third, Heinz Harald Frentzen is currently fourth, Mika Häkkinen fifth, and Gerhard Berger sixth. Come back to first qualifying. You're watching Mika Häkkinen. You just saw Damon Hill. He's fastest so far. In fact, the two Williams Renaults head the timesheet. Hill ahead of Coulthard, Jean Alesi third, Heinz Harald Frentzen fourth. And this man, Mika Häkkinen, in fifth place currently, but it could be an improvement here. It's been looking like a very, very committed lap. And let's see if it's any improvement for Mika Häkkinen. Well, it's an improvement in time, but not in position. He remains fifth on a 2 minute 16.370.
And Mika Häkkinen and Mark Blundell have got a qualifying engine from Mercedes-Benz for this session and for Saturday qualifying, but misses the man, current world champion Michael Schumacher, and the man with only an 11-point championship lead. Lifts off as he comes into Blanchimont. Those two flicks of flame indicate even the quickest of quick. Show prudence and wisdom here at Spa. But Schumacher really just preparing now to start a lap. And you may notice as drivers come through the bus-stop chicane, they sometimes do not come through the first part quickly. The reason is they're just preparing to make a clean and positive exit. And this is the point. Schumacher had an uncharacteristic spin this morning. This time fine. But to get the maximum speed across that start-finish line, when you are completing your out lap, it is actually more productive to go through the first part of the bus-stop chicane slowly and then progressively pick up your speed to ensure the perfect exit from that bus stop, and then the rush across the line up into La Source Serpent Bend. Now, up this long uphill climb, and in fact on television you don't get a true impression of the rise and fall of the Spa-Francorchamps circuit. If you look at the effect, the ramp effect that drivers are faced when they come into Eau Rouge, it's almost like you're going into a solid wall. It is so steep. Coming down now into Rivage. And again, the wide line. Will Schumacher cut across? Well, much the same as we saw from Damon Hill, who happens just to be watching on his TV screen. And then again, the plunge down the hill, fifth and sixth gears, then on the brakes. In the wet, probably taking fourth gear to enter, but changing into fifth midway round. And there's a squeeze of the throttle in these conditions, not a thump, and flat out as you would do in the dry.
Michael Schumacher then coming round. This will be his first time lap in this first qualifying session. He certainly left it pretty late to take on his first lap there. You can just see a little slide as he comes through the Fang section down towards Stavelot now. The last two right-handers before they rejoin the public road here at Spa. This is the purpose-built piece of circuit, and there you can see on the split time that he's really not competitive with Damon Hill's fastest time so far. But remember, this first time lap from Schumacher, this really just one to get in the bank and get him somewhere on the grid, perhaps before he puts in a really sharp effort on the next lap. Flavio Briatore watching from the pits as Schumacher comes down into the bus stop. Remember, a disappointing outing last time in Hungary when it looked as though they were going to get that second place behind Damon Hill and retiring with just a few laps to go and seeing the championship lead narrowed from 21 points to 11. Schumacher goes sixth fastest, 1.3 seconds slower than Hill.
For that lap from Schumacher, you can see look how much he's having to work to get the best from the Benetton chassis. The car does not look as stable or comfortable to drive as the Williams of Coulthard and Damon Hill. And just, it's an edgy car. The way the car is designed, the way the car has been created around the demands and the needs of Michael Schumacher, are producing a car which in extremes, like we're saying this afternoon, mean it is it's a knife-edge car, where in conditions like this you want a car that ideally is like a Ferrari. The Ferrari has appeared to be the most drivable. Glorious power slides from Schumacher, but really it's losing time. Every time that appears in the corner, those are fractions, thousands of seconds that are just ebbing away. Again, in Rivage, the back end drifts off. Now, that was probably because a combination of he felt it going, balances the car on the throttle. Again, you can see, Well, Mark Blundell, he stopped. This is the second time we've seen Mark Blundell on camera this weekend. The first time we saw him this morning, he was stopped. And sadly, the second time it appears he's stopped as well.
But Michael Schumacher, for all that sliding, has put in a good first section time. He's got the fastest time running up to the first split, which is just before the Les Combes corner. So this could be an improvement on the current fastest time from Damon Hill if Schumacher can keep up this sort of performance. Remember, last year he missed out on getting pole position in the dying moments of the qualifying session to Rubens Barrichello. Schumacher came out in the last moments on slick tyres, but he actually spun it at that Rivage corner where we saw him get into a bit of a slide just now. I'm sure he'll have memories of that. He's seeking his first ever pole here at Spa this weekend, and although he's had some wonderful results here, remember, he made a dramatic debut for Jordan back in 1991, and he took his first ever Grand Prix victory here at Spa in 1992. He's yet to take the pole position here.
Well, he's got a chance, although he was just over 4/10 slower at the second segment time. There's still a lot of racetrack between there and here. Michael Schumacher has gone second quickest, and he retains that 0.468 disadvantage. So in that last segment of track, maintained. So again, the run downhill, and again you see how much Schumacher uses the throttle of the car. Now there's right, left, uphill. And then at the radio, that's the part of the circuit that the majority of the safety work was carried out. The part of the circuit where we saw that enormous accident 2 years ago with Zanardi, that has been moved back. And the driver's line, as he crests the hill now, is much, much better. He can see where he's pointing the car, as in previous years you just aimed it and hoped that when you got to the other side, you were where you hoped you were going to be.
Back down towards Rivage, and Michael Schumacher, is he slowing down? I think he has. He's backed off this time. So, as we have a little way to go in this session, just over 13 minutes, it's still Damon Hill fastest from Michael Schumacher with David Coulthard third. So we've got a Renault 1, 2, 3, and remember, no sign of Johnny Herbert because of that accident this morning. He is fit to drive, but he would have to take over the car of Schumacher. Schumacher's only done 3 laps. I think it unlikely that we'll see Johnny out in this session, to be honest. So behind the Renault-powered cars is Jean Alesi, fourth for Ferrari, Heinz Harald Frentzen, then fifth, Mika Häkkinen sixth, then Eddie Irvine, Rubens Barrichello, Gerhard Berger's down in 9th place, and Martin Brundle is currently 10th, and just behind Brundle, a better performance so far this year from Ukio Katayama. He's 11th in the first of the Tyrrells. Mika Salo, remember, he's learning the circuit for the first time, so learning it in these conditions, John, not particularly enviable.
Well, for Mika Salo, of course, probably reminiscent of what it's like in Finland in the winter. That's the amount of grip that you would have here this afternoon. Maybe part of the reason why Katayama up to 11th place at this stage in qualifying. Tyrrell have done a lot of work. They've done a lot of testing. They're getting to grips with running 2 shock absorbers on the front of the Tyrrell this year, as opposed to the Hydro Link, which they've been working with and trying to improve.
Welcome back to first qualifying once again here from Spa, and well, the situation at the moment, Damon Hill is still fastest with Michael Schumacher second, David Coulthard is third. You're looking at a spin from Roberto Moreno. He just spun coming into the Lasso hairpin in the 40 Ford, but no harm done, and the experienced Brazilian able to rejoin once again. So Hill, Schumacher, Coulthard, Alesi fourth, Frentzen fifth, and Häkkinen sixth, and it looks to me as though Gerhard Berger could be getting ready.
Indeed, I think that's the most graphic example. Well, we were looking at Gerhard Berger preparing to begin a flying lap. So we're now looking at the circuit and not a car inside. Pit lane, not a car inside. There we have Jean-Christophe Bouillon getting a baptism of a wet Spa. And really, I think, a fairly tough first season or so for the young Frenchman, having been the Williams test driver and covered himself in glory by being able to match Damon Hill and David Coulthard. But when he goes into a team in a car that is not quite so to the front, then the inexperience and the limitations of a young driver are much more to the fore. Gerhard Berger, this is coming up to the end of the straight. This is a flying lap, and Berger ought to be interesting to watch. Currently down in 9th place, having completed 4 laps, but at this point, he is the quickest man in that first segment.
So Berger taking advantage of the gradually drying circuit. You can see for yourselves around the track as they go now that it is much, much drier in various places. And we've got less than 10 minutes to go in this session now. So the question is whether he can continue to improve. Second checkpoint, you can see 139.227 from Damon Hill. And Gerhard Berger heading downhill towards that second checkpoint. Jean Alesi currently fourth fastest. Berger is right down in ninth place at the moment, so he needs to really find something here through the right-left. Now the second check is just coming up. It's on the approach to the first of the right-handers at Stavilo, and this will give us a really clear idea as to whether Berger can beat Hill on this lap. 38.39. Well, it's a 40.042. Doesn't look as though the Austrian's going to be able to go quicker than Hill, but he should be able to improve on his ninth place.
Indeed, that's going to get him up onto the first two rows of the grid. But literally, as we are saying this, there will be somebody else out on the track. It might be David Coulthard, it might be Damon Hill, who both have just gone back out. And for Berger, the worst of all situations, Giovanni Laragi in the Pacific, making his way round. Berger, of course, will be frustrated. He will be trying to judge where he is going to catch and pass the Pacific. And time for Berger, improvement, but not as much as we had expected. Up to sixth place, 2 minutes, 15.940. And John Todd's face, the frustration. He knows that Berger would have been marginally quicker. Whether it was sufficient to put him fifth, that would have demoted Frentzen down one place or not. So that's the frustration on any circuit, even the longest circuit in the Grand Prix calendar like Spa-Francorchamps. You catch a car in the wrong place, and that can destroy a lap.
So he tries for another lap, and you saw him, as you say, go past Giovanni Lavaggi. The Pacifics are running today. There was a little bit of doubt about it yesterday with some legal cases going on, but it's all been sorted out, and the Pacifics will be running this weekend in both qualifying sessions and at the race itself. So Giovanni Lavaggi currently down in 23rd place and last so far because, of course, no sign of Johnny Herbert in this session. He is going to have to do all his qualifying in the second session come Saturday. But Damon Hill on the circuit in the closing stages of this qualifying session now, just over 5 minutes to go. He's currently fastest on a 15.143, and he wants to try and further improve that, try and take the time further away from Michael Schumacher through the left-hander at Blanchimont. Such a fast corner. You can see the vortices coming off the rear wing, and now it looks as though Hill, I think that wasn't going to be a flying lap, but this one is going to be.
Well, after all that good work, Ben, Damon Hill slows down. I suspect he's going to prepare, but we just again, camera direction goes on to Gerhard Berger. So we don't know quite what Damon Hill is going to do. He did come across the start-finish line. 2 minutes 24.845. In our estimation, that was Damon slowing right down and then accelerating cleanly on to the beginning of another flying lap. As you see, Gerhard Berger coming up to this Blanchimont sequence of corners as we cut back to watch Damon Hill go through Eau Rouge. But just look how well that car is working. You can see when a car works. It gives confidence. The signal is through the driver. The grip is there. Damon Hill knows he's got a car that is capable of increasing that 0.468 of a second gap between himself and Michael Schumacher, and he wants to hammer home that advantage.
So Hill, winner here last year and the year before, of course, winning last year after the disqualification of Michael Schumacher, and winning the previous year after a tremendous battle, getting past teammate Alain Prost, and then managing to stave off the challenge from Michael Schumacher. He loves this circuit, knows it well, but they both do. They both had good results here, so we're really in for a tremendous battle all weekend, both in qualifying and the race. And Hill now trying to take his time further away. Remember, David Coulthard is currently third, but only a fraction behind Michael Schumacher. So a prospect perhaps once again of getting both of the Williams Renaults ahead of the Benetton Renault of Michael Schumacher. Exactly what they did in Hungary there. Damon Hill certainly sliding the car again.
But that's a slide that confidence knows is not going to get him into trouble. And Damon Hill, there's a split time at 39.227. He's 0.6 down in that time, so I cannot see how he can claw back over half a second. But of course, there's over a kilometre of racetrack remaining. You get through these two Blanchimont corners quickly, you can pick up amazing amount of times. It's here on the exit. If you can come out of there kilometers faster, it carries all the way up to the bus stop chicane. But it's here, you've got to be clean, you've got to be prudent. Damon gets on the throttle, doesn't nail it, doesn't overdrive the car. There's the important and critical part of the bus stop chicane. It's the exit. Well, Michael Schumacher has got a lot of work to do. He was quickest. He currently is quickest at that first intermediate section. So we've got to wait until we get all the way back down to Stavelot to see whether that advantage has been maintained. Damon Hill's time on the left, Michael Schumacher's time on the right. As if I need to tell anybody. So, 25 hundredths of a second, Michael Schumacher has an opportunity in these closing moments to nick provisional pole from Damon Hill.
So the battle rejoined once again. Schumacher, but Gerhard Berger, let me tell you, has just gone fastest by 8 thousandths of a second. Gerhard Berger, 2 minutes, 15.135, and Berger snatches the fastest time from Hill. But what can Schumacher do on this lap? He's just got the exit of the bus stop chicane to deal with, and then he'll come flying across the start-finish line. Let's see if Schumacher can improve on that 15.1 from Berger. It's a 15.377, and the top three are covered by just 2 tenths of a second, but Coulthard's just gone faster than him. So David Coulthard, in fact, has just gone third. As you see that caption come up, it's now Gerhard Berger fastest, Damon Hill second, David Coulthard third, and Michael Schumacher finds himself down in fourth place. Jean Alesi fifth, and then Heinz Harald Frentzen sixth.
Well, this session, which was a wet and miserable start, is turning into one of those wonderful, exciting sessions where, in the closing moments, everybody is on the track, and literally, by the second, everybody is going quicker. We've got 1 minute remaining, so those that are crossing the line have chance. Berger, again, quickest at that first intermediate point, comes down, having exited Puho into this S's right, left. In these conditions, third gear in dry, fourth gear. So into the second intermediate, Berger's time to improve. He's looking for something quicker than 139.4. He's done it. He's 4 tenths of a second. But of course, Damon Hill, who's on the track, David Coulthard, Michael Schumacher, the gains that Gerhard Berger has seen, I would say, have come from the circuit. All three other competitors ought to realize the same.
So can Gerhard Berger take the pole position, the provisional pole position in this session? He's certainly on a very, very good lap indeed. Michael Schumacher also is on a good lap. He's put in the highest sector speed at the end of the first sector. So let's just see whether Gerhard can finish this off smoothly. Is he going to improve on his best so far? Is he in the 14s? Yes, he is. 2 minutes 14.744. Gerhard Berger holding the fastest time now by nearly 4 tenths of a second from Damon Hill, and David Coulthard another 4 tenths down on that. But here comes his main challenger, Michael Schumacher. Well, we still don't know whether these two are going to end up being teammates next year at Ferrari. There's still no news as to whether Gerhard Berger will be remaining at Ferrari with Michael Schumacher joining. But the battle is on between them in this session for the fastest time. Is Schumacher going to do enough here? We wait for him to cross the line. The checker flag's out. It's a 14.962. Schumacher goes second. He goes ahead of Hill and Coulthard.
And both are on the circuit. Hill and Coulthard have yet to take the checkered flag. The two Williams back onto the second row of the grid. Gerhard Berger, Michael Schumacher provisionally on the front row. We don't know whether they'll be there in a further 15 or 20 seconds. We have to wait and see what happens when Hill and Coulthard take the checkered flag. But it looks like it's all over. So, Gerhard Berger will have a smile after all his problems this morning, after all previous disappointments here in Spa-Francorchamps. And we had a session without incident or trouble. Credit to the teams, great credit to the drivers, because these conditions today were extreme. And on a circuit which is a pure road circuit, it is even more difficult. So, Gerhard Berger will be a happy little fella tonight, and I think the schnapps will be flowing amongst the Austrians that follow Berger and work in Formula One.
So, Gerhard Berger sets the provisional pole position here at Spa with Michael Schumacher second fastest and Jean Alesi going third in the dying moments as well. So Alesi's improved. We've got Ferrari first and third, and that's going to make Michael Schumacher happy as well in some ways because he's going to be going to that team next year. Damon Hill finds himself down in fourth place. David Coulthard fifth. Heinz Harald Frentzen is sixth. Then Mika Häkkinen seventh. Eddie Irvine, Rubens Barrichello, and Martin Brundle rounding out the top 10. But a tremendous first qualifying session. And interestingly, if Gerhard Berger can hold on to this pole position through the second qualifying tomorrow, then he'll retake the lead of the current drivers in terms of numbers of poles. Damon Hill joined him on 10 in the last race in Hungary, and Gerhard will be hoping to try and take that statistic further away again. But the most important thing from his point of view will be to start the Belgian Grand Prix from the front. Let's just have a quick look further down the list, pick out any major performances. Jean-Christophe Pouillon's 11th, that's a good effort in the second of the Saubers. Olivier Panis 12th, Luca Bedoya, Mika Salo, Marc Blondel's right down in 15th, so he's a long way down. Ukio Katayama 16th, Pedro Lamy 17th, Max Papis 18th, then Taki Inoue, Roberto Moreno, Montermini, Denise and Lavaggi. Well, the track conditions certainly did improve throughout that session, and Gerhard Berger had the Ferrari tuned to perfection to take the fastest time.
Well, Ferrari, they had a little bit of a test this week. Further developments. They didn't come here saying we've made quantum leaps. They've made small improvements. But of course, on a track like this, in these conditions, the experience of Berger in a car that we have seen in the past is sympathetic to wet weather conditions, took full advantage of it. And it's delighted Gerhard Berger.
So it's been a fascinating first session, and of course there'll be more of this tomorrow, and the weather forecast is not particularly promising, but we hope that things will be better to give us a good second qualifying session. Michael Schumacher being pushed back into the pit garage and not able to take a provisional pole this time, but he's ahead of his main rival Damon Hill, down in fourth place. Of course, tonight we're bringing you the highlights from the first qualifying, plus interviews and stories in pole position, and tomorrow's second qualifying live at 1 o'clock Central European time, that's 12 midday in the UK. Well, we'll have to wait and see whether we do see an improvement in weather conditions, but if it promises to be as good as today's session, we should be in for a real treat. Gerhard Berger, Michael Schumacher, the two fastest from the first qualifying day. For now, from John Watson and Ben Edwards, goodbye.